They say crows remember kindness, or cruelty. In the high valleys where the snow sits longer than the sun, the crows gathered on the chimney of a cabin long forgotten by joy. There lived May Ellis, a woman hollowed by silence and years. Her husband, lost to a mining collapse. Her child, to the fever that swept through the mountain before spring. Only the crows remained, and sometimes, when the fire crackled just right, she spoke to them like old friends. May's home sat beyond the last fence post of the town of Dry Hollow, a town that preferred its grief silent, and its women obedient. But May stayed after everyone else left, living on the edge of wilderness and memory. It was during the thaw of a stubborn winter that she found him, a man half buried in snow and blood, at the base of the slope behind her garden. He should have been dead. She didn't ask who he was, or why an arrow still pierced his side. She didn't ask what war he belonged to. She only hauled his frozen body back to her cabin, inch by inch, whispering to the crows not to watch her too closely. The fire never burned so hot as it did that night. When the fever broke, he didn't speak. Not a word. May changed his bandages with hands steadier than they had any right to be. His skin was weathered like bark, tattooed with symbols she didn't understand. He flinched at shadows, refused food unless she left it on the floor and turned her back. He was a man who had seen too many endings. At night, May listened to the wind and his breath, both shallow, both restless. Sometimes she sang old lullabies, not for him, but to keep her own mind from drifting into the deep. Slowly, the man's eyes softened. He drank water from her hands. He let her comb the blood from his matted hair. Still he did not speak. But one morning, as the mountain mist spilled through the window like a ghost, he traced a word on the wooden floorboards with shaking fingers. "Mother." Then he wept. And May, for the first time in years, wept with him. The spring brought color, but not peace. May noticed fires across the ridge, too high for hunters, too many for campers. The townsfolk whispered of raids, of tribal warriors reclaiming stolen land. Men boarded windows and loaded rifles. May fed chickens. The warrior began to walk again, slowly, painfully. He watched the horizon like someone expecting ghosts. His eyes never left the smoke curling above the ridge. She asked him nothing. He offered her one word more. Vanished. That night, he sat by the fire and hummed a tune she didn't recognize. The crows returned to the chimney, watching with quiet judgment. May fed them scraps. They stayed longer than usual. He left before sunrise, barefoot, carrying nothing but a carved pipe. May had once kept in a box of her husband's belongings. He hadn't asked for it, just stared at it like a memory he couldn't touch. She gave it to him in silence. 3 days passed. The crows vanished. The woods went quiet. Then, on the 4th morning, the crows came back. Not alone, but followed by a procession. A line of riders crested the hill beyond the field, painted in ash and ochre, silent as dawn. At their center rode the man she had nursed, now clothed in ceremonial fur and feathers, his eyes steady, his wound healed. He was no longer a ghost. He was a chief, and May, still holding the empty pipe box, stepped onto the porch with hands that no longer trembled. He called her Wind Between Pines, in front of his people and hers. The name carried the weight of memory and breath. May did not speak. She didn't need to. The townsfolk watched from fences and windows, some with rifles, most with shame. The chief spoke in his language, words that danced like firelight. A translator said it was a story of a wounded bird and the tree that sheltered him, a story of second birth. May stood still, her eyes reflecting the clouds. She didn't belong to their tribe. She didn't belong to the town. But for the first time, someone named her not for what she had lost, but for what she had given. He stayed near the cabin for many weeks. The people camped in the valley below, singing into the dusk, teaching children to dance barefoot in the dirt. May's porch became a gathering place. She sat in her rocking chair, carving wood for no reason but rhythm. One day, a young girl laid a blanket at May's feet, woven with strange symbols, the threads tight with reverence. No one explained. They didn't need to. May slept wrapped in that blanket each night, and never dreamed of the fever again. Old Tom Brayer had never liked the mountains, said they echoed too much, made a man hear things better left unsaid. But he stayed, because Dry Hollow was all he knew, and spite can root a man deeper than love ever could. When May's porch became a place where strangers gathered, and songs, in a foreign tongue, lilted over the pines, Tom didn't take kindly to it. He stood outside the church with his bent back and rusted rifle, muttering things like witch widow and heathen chief. Folks didn't stop him. They never had. The town's silence was his shadow. What he lacked in warmth, he made up for in volume, and there were always a few who nodded along. But Tom wasn't just angry. He was afraid. He remembered the raids, long ago, when he was a boy and his father's barn burned in the night. He remembered a brother's grave dug shallow in panic. And memories, when left to rot, don't fade, they ferment. One afternoon, he hobbled up to May's gate, spitting chew and slurring threats. "You lettin' devils sleep in your home now, May?" he barked. Or did they whisper lies into that old crow heart of yours? May looked up from her carving, slow and calm. "Tom," she said, "there's a bitterness in you that even fire wouldn't swallow. Best leave it out here with the mud." But Tom kept coming, every week, more slurred, more desperate. He shouted names, called the chief a painted ghost. He even threw a stone once. It missed, but the silence afterward was sharper than any blade. The chief said nothing, not once, just stood beside May with eyes like coals dampened by rain. Then one night, Tom's house burned. No one saw who lit it. No one claimed vengeance. But in the ash, beside the chimney that collapsed inward, May found something odd. A pipe. Not hers. Not the chief's. A plain wooden pipe, snapped in half and left beneath the scorched window frame. May stared at it for a long while. Then she walked back to her porch without a word. Tom lived, though barely. They found him coughing blood in the field, eyes wide with smoke and memory. He mumbled of shadows and spirits, of a voice whispering, "Forgiveness isn't asked, it's returned." They say he left Dry Hollow before the leaves turned gold, headed east, where the sky's too wide to hold grudges. And May? She never mentioned the fire. But the next morning, she swept her porch a little slower. The chief planted sage along the walkway. The crows stayed close, silent witnesses to smoke, sorrow, and the weight of forgiveness unspoken. The fire circle became a ritual. Each dusk, as the sun slipped behind the jagged hills, the people gathered in the hollow near May's cabin. Children sat cross-legged in dirt, elders wrapped in blankets of woven story. The chief, his voice low and rough as the river stones, told tales that curled like smoke through the trees. He never raised his voice. He didn't need to. The stillness listened better than ears ever could. One night, May asked him why he spoke in riddles and myths, never naming the war that scarred his shoulder or the place he called home. He stirred the coals with a stick. "Truth can burn when spoken plain," he said, "so I shape it into shadow. Then it warms instead of wounds." That evening, he told a story about a child born under a moon that wouldn't rise, how the elders said he'd bring misfortune, how he wandered the wild with no tribe until a tree split, open in a storm, and sheltered him. The tree, they said, had once been a woman who gave up her soul to keep a stranger warm. When the storm passed, the boy was never the same. He began to heal others, and every wound he touched made his own lighter. When the story ended, May didn't speak, but she held her breath, as though something inside her finally exhaled. Others began sharing stories too, even the townsfolk. Quiet at first, like testing ice in early spring. An old man confessed he'd once stolen corn from a tribal field in a drought. A woman said she lost her sister to scarlet fever, and every dream since had been read. The fire listened, and the crows above, perched on branches like silent scribes, never once cawed. May took to writing again. At night, with only lantern light and the chief's breathing steady beside her, she scratched lines into old parchment. Not letters to anyone, just moments, fragments, like prayers to no God at all. One morning, she left a page near the chief's bed. On it, just 8 words, "I was soil until your sorrow made me bloom." He didn't speak of it, but that night, when he told his story, the tree was renamed. It bore May's name. The first frost came early that year, biting the fields with quiet teeth. The valley dulled into a hush of gray and silver, and the mornings held the scent of smoke and frozen earth. The people prepared in silence, like animals that remembered harder winters. May's hands had grown stiff. The fire that once warmed her cabin now merely softened the cold. Still, she moved with purpose, splitting kindling, drying herbs, folding blankets once made for a child that never grew tall. Outside her door, the crows lined the porch rail, black and watchful, as if sensing a turn in the wind. One evening, just after the sun dipped beneath the pines, a rider came alone. No caravan, no escort, only a mottled horse and a shadow heavier than any saddlebag. He dismounted slow, like a man bearing grief that had taken root in his spine. May stepped onto the porch. The chief stood beside her without being called. The rider nodded low, not in greeting, but in reverence. "I am Casca," he said, "sent from the north." From beneath his cloak, he pulled a necklace, a crude loop of leather, strung with polished bone pieces, each etched with a symbol. Some were simple, others carved so intricately they seemed alive. Casca handed it to the chief, who took it in silence. He ran his thumb across one piece and closed his eyes. His breath hitched, just once. Later, as firelight licked the walls, the chief explained, the necklace had belonged to his mother. She had passed in the snow, clutching it to her chest. Casca had found her. She had whispered May's name with her last breath, though she had never met her. May didn't understand. Not at first. "She dreamt of you," the chief said quietly. "For years. Said she saw your face in the smoke, that a woman with sorrowed eyes would be my salvation." May held the necklace gently, her fingers trembling over the bones. "I never knew her," she said. "But she knew you." That night, the wind howled harder than it had in weeks. The crows vanished from the porch, and May sat up in bed, staring at the necklace on her nightstand, wondering how far prayers could travel before they found a home. There came a time, not long after the frost settled for good, when May stopped speaking, not from illness, not from grief, just stillness, the kind that doesn't ask for attention. She would smile, she would listen, but words left her like birds from a nest, flown without warning. At first, the chief worried. He sat with her by the fire, tried to coax sound from her with song and story. But May only smiled, nodded, and went on weaving. She seemed lighter, not burdened by the silence, but cloaked in it. One evening, as smoke curled like a question above the chimney, he asked, "Why don't you speak anymore?" May reached for his hand, pressed his palm to her chest. Then she whispered, soft as ember crackle, "Because now I can hear." And he understood. The silence wasn't absence. It was a listening to the earth, to the trees, to the ache of time, to the lives she had touched without knowing, and those who had loved her before they even saw her face. In her quiet, the people gathered closer. Children leaned in, women hummed the lullabies May once sang aloud. Even the crows returned, not to watch, but to rest. The fire circle grew, and the stories deepened. They weren't just told, they were passed, like cloth or bread. And May sat at the center, not as a widow, but as a witness, a keeper of memory, a tree carved from patience. She began writing again, not stories, but names. Names she dreamed, names she heard in the leaves. Some had lived, some had died, but all had meaning. One name she buried in the soil beneath her porch, written on parchment, wrapped in sage, Thomas Brayer, forgiven. The wind didn't howl that night. The snow fell soft and the world held its breath. It had been a dry winter, the kind where the snow comes late and brittle, clinging more to memory than to earth. But by late March, the sky broke open. Rain came in sheets, like grief that had waited too long. The river that curved behind May's cabin, once a narrow silver thread, began to bloat and swell like something breathing under the soil. At first, no one worried. The people in the hollow had lived through worse. They stacked wood higher, moved tents further from the banks, murmured to the spirits of water to spare the young. But rivers do not bargain. They remember what was taken from them. On the third night of rain, the chief stood on the porch with May. The sky hung low, purple as bruised skin. Below, in the valley, the water had swallowed the path. Trees stood like silent mourners waist-deep in flood. May touched his arm and asked softly, "Do you remember how I found you?" He nodded. "Blood and snow. You had no reason to save me." May's gaze stayed on the river. "Then let's make a reason now." Together, they left the porch and walked to the edge of the rise. Others followed, the fire circle's children, elders wrapped in soaked wool, townsfolk who no longer feared the songs from the valley. In silence, they began carrying stones, flat ones, heavy ones, whatever they could find. A wall, slow and sacred, began to rise along the river's edge. No shouting, no commands, just hands in mud and breath steaming in the rain. May's fingers bled. She didn't stop. The chief's shoulder throbbed with old pain. He didn't stop. The townsfolk worked beside the tribe, side by side, no longer split by fences or myth. The crow perched on the wagon wheel above, watching. By dawn, the river had crested. It came roaring, full of limbs and memory, trying to swallow everything that stood. But the wall held. Just enough. Just enough. That morning, as the sky cleared for the first time in days, May sat on the bank, mud up to her knees, rainwater in her boots, the chief beside her. She closed her eyes and whispered, "Let them say we stood." He didn't answer. He just took her hand and kissed the bruise on her palm. And the river, sated for now, flowed on. Summer returned slow, like an old friend testing the porch steps. Wildflowers bloomed where the water once clawed. Children ran barefoot again, laughter chasing the scent of pine and bread. May's hair had gone entirely white, not brittle, but soft, like clouds that had made peace with the sky. Her steps were slower now, but her gaze steady as ever. The chief built her something, quietly, without ceremony. Day by day, board by board. Behind the cabin, under a cluster of birch trees, he raised a small wooden hall. Not a chapel, not a lodge, something between. The people called it the Room of Smoke and Song. Inside there were no pews, only cushions and carved benches, walls lined with stories, written on leather, bone, paper, bark. May's words, his words, their people's words, stories of hunger and fire, of exile and return, of a widow and a wounded man who found each other not by chance, but by echo. He carved above the doorway in his language, but the translation was left for her to find. She made a home in the broken part of time. When she read it, she said nothing. But that night, as they lay beside each other beneath the cedar beams of her cabin, she placed her hand on his chest and said, "You brought me back to the world." "No," he whispered. "I brought myself to you." May passed quietly one dawn, before the first frost of autumn. She was wrapped in the woven blanket gifted by the child years before. The crows gathered, not on the chimney, but on the birch trees above the hall. The chief did not speak for many days, but on the seventh morning he entered the room of smoke and song, and began to tell her story, not with sorrow, but with the quiet joy of a man who had once been forgotten and was now full of memory. He lived many more seasons, but never again in war. His final act, before he too crossed into the wind, was this. He carved one last name into the sacred wall. It read, May Ellis, Wind Between Pines. She was the fire that taught silence to speak. And so, in the valley that once swallowed sorrow, her story lingered, not like a ghost, but like a breath, whispered still every time the wind touched the pines.